So my name is Courtney Silverthorne. In addition to one of the Associate Vice Presidents in the Science Partnerships Department at the FNIH, I also have the honor of serving as the Director of the Accelerating Medicines Partnership Program. And I am absolutely thrilled to be able to welcome all of you to this 10th anniversary symposium, especially since the dream I had last night where I slept through 2 alarms, didn't wake up until 10 a.m., and then had to clean my hotel room before I could come down to the conference was not actually real. So very grateful for that as well. Everyone in this room has touched the AMP program in some way, but we really wanted to start off our celebration by giving you all an appreciation for how this monumental program came into existence. And so to help tell the story of the vision and the launch of the Accelerating Medicines Partnership Program, today I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Francis Collins and David Wally. If you could join me on stage for the opening session. Dr. Francis Collins was the 16th and longest serving director of the NIH, and is currently a distinguished investigator at the Center for Precision Health Research at the National Human Genome Research Institute. David Wally recently concluded a nearly 18-year career at the FNIH, including serving as the interim CEO and president of the foundation from September of 2021 to May of 2022. And I had the pleasure of working both for and with David for nearly 2 years prior to his retirement. So thank you for joining us today.
They didn't have microphones, so we started.
All right, so to start us off, Francis, I wanted you to tell us a little bit about what the landscape of public-private partnerships at the NIH looked like in the early 20-teens, and what need was the Accelerating Medicines Partnership Program designed to fill?
Okay, so this is origin story time. Is that where we're going? And let me just say, I'm delighted to be here and to see all of you gathered to celebrate the 10 years of this phenomenal, unprecedented public-private partnership across all these different diseases and applications that have brought together people with brilliant ideas and vision from all sectors and figured out how to work together in truly productive ways. And it's just a joy to be able to be here and hear all the things that have accomplished in those 10 years. And especially for me, since I stepped down as NIH director about 2 years ago, to hear what happened in the last 2 years, where I have not been quite as closely aligned with what's going on. So how did this come to be? I became NIH director in August of 2009. One of my goals was to try to see how we could advance the translational part of our agenda. It did seem like basic science was coming up with some pretty cool findings. And yet, it didn't seem like we'd quite linked up with ways to proceed quickly to figure out how those could turn into clinical benefits. A particular example, of course, was genomics. What do you know? Because we were reaching the point because of technologies and catalogs of human variation from things like HapMap, of doing genome-wide association studies. And this was like this big moment. We're going to start to figure out what are the real genetic factors in common diseases like diabetes and Alzheimer's and rheumatoid arthritis. And I think everybody was sort of champing at the bit, waiting for the big reveal. And I remember a conversation with somebody from industry. Said, yes, we wanted you to give us targets. You gave us too damn many. What are we supposed to do with all this? GWAS studies just kept giving more and more. Interesting insights, but how do you decide which of those are targetable, which of those are appropriate for a big investment, a big bet in something that might or might not work as a therapeutic? So that was clearly a place where we didn't have the kind of links we needed. I mean, NIH had lots of partnerships over the years. They were usually focused on a particular opportunity. Maybe it's infectious disease. I mean, look at what happened with HIV/AIDS. Talk about a partnership in the 1990s that ended up saving lives in the millions by coming up with direct-acting antivirals against HIV/AIDS. Or cancer partnerships, which certainly had flourished in terms of developing new approaches to that disease. But we hadn't maybe stepped back into this more pre-competitive, exploratory space in the way that now seemed to be a good idea. So what to do about that? There's a regular gathering of all of the chief scientists of the pharmaceutical companies, 20 companies, get together once or twice a year in a meeting that's called the Hever meeting, H-E-V-E-R. And you might wonder, why is it called that? Well, the very first one of them was held in Hever Castle, a place I have never been, but apparently it's rather nice, somewhere in the UK. But it always got called the Hever meeting after that. And as NIH director, I got invited to come mostly to listen, although it's really about what Big Pharma is trying to do in terms of their science. And that was a particularly signal moment, I think. The meeting was held at St. Michael's out here on the Eastern Shore. And all of the folks who I didn't know very well, who were leading the science efforts in Big Pharmas, were there talking about what they're excited about and what they're frustrated about. And pretty clearly, this issue about what to do with this outpouring of potential insights from genomics was a bit of a topic. And somewhat on the spur of the moment, and particularly with Michael Dolston's involvement, because he was leading the meeting, we got into this conversation about maybe we ought to do something really bold here and try to come up with a strategy that would bring industry scientists and NIH and academic scientists together to try to see if we could answer those questions more quickly as a consortium than we would if we just tackled it side by side. That, in my mind, is where the concept of AMP was born. I think that might have been 2011 or early 2012, but it was about then.
Thank you. And David, the FNIH has a very large and very impressive portfolio of public-private partnerships now. But what did that space look like for the foundation back in 2011, 2012?
So there were a few public-private partnerships out there, both at FNIH and elsewhere, that I think we had learned a lot from, most notably ADNI, the Biomarkers Consortium. There was the IMI in Europe had gotten started. But there were two things. The models for these were all a little bit different. In many cases, the governance between the government side and the private sector side was a lot more arm's length. The funding model was a little different. Either government was putting in a lot of more money, as on the ADNI side, or in the Biomarkers Consortium, which was funded almost entirely by industry, and Europe had its own unique model of dealing with this in the IMI. So there was that, and no one was addressing this issue that Francis was talking about. People forget that at that time there were a lot of articles about the declining productivity of industry.
Right, remember
drug development
Eroom's law?
Yes, yes, which is sort of Moore's law is backwards. We're going backwards in time. And so when they got together, Francis, I remember you telling me that this was the issue that people focused on. And so the unique thing about this was really looking into that translational science, and specifically at something they called disease deconstruction, which I believe was sort of defined as the systematic characterization of a heterogeneous, not that well understood set of diseases in human populations. An early discussion point was, look, animal models are fine, but that's not going to tell us what we need to know. And how you bring together large amounts of clinical and molecular data so you can do a better job of more rationally selecting targets. And so that was really what was different about AMP. And the scale also starting up in 3 major diseases at once.
So it sounds like the overall theme of AMP was set as early as 2012 in disease deconstruction and in target validation. But how did you arrive at those initial 3 project areas?
It wasn't easy, but it was informative, and it's probably relevant to, as you're now thinking about other projects to add to AMP. So what to do? It looks as if there was enough momentum coming from both public and private sectors to explore this, but okay, explore it how? What would be the disorders where this would be the most fruitful to put together a project? And if so, what would the project look like? We had the good fortune there to bring alongside some consultants from BCG, And there was a lot of back and forth interviewing, time and effort with all the companies that we wanted to engage with to say, what are they interested in? What do they see in this landscape of opportunity would be the place where such a partnership would really help? And there were many proposals about many different applications, and ultimately over the course of a year or so, it began to sort of coalesce around, actually it was 4, and then it shrank back to 3. And the 4 were diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, Alzheimer's disease, and schizophrenia. We got to schizophrenia later, but we didn't manage to get it off the ground at the beginning. And again, the deal had to be that if we were going to do this, there really had to be skin in the game from both NIH and from the companies that were participating. So this was a good way to figure out, were the company representatives really interested? Because they were going to be expected to donate funds and time of some of their leading scientists and some of their leadership to make it happen. So there had to be a really strong belief that this was worth doing. It wasn't just checking a box and saying, okay, that's fine, and then forget about it. And I think that's what took a lot of the time, was getting to the point of people actually then, in the usual challenge about budget cycles, figuring out, were they willing to actually pitch in? And over the time, gradually, that settled on those 3 diseases. But then what to do for those 3 diseases ended up being very different. This is not a cookie cutter kind of approach where each disease has the same strategy, not at all. And that's, I think, one of the strengths of AMP, has been that way all along. Let's really look at what the opportunities and the needs are, and let's design for that disorder exactly what would fill those gaps. And that's what also took a fair amount of time. But then ultimately that all kind of coalesced. And 10 years ago yesterday, it was February 4th, I believe, 2014, was the announcement of AMP and the focus on the 3 diseases, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, which got us off the ground, got us a little bit of visibility in the press, and then, oh my God, we got to do this. But I think at that point, the process of building the specifics, not both the diseases and what to work on, had by that time created a lot of a sense of community between the leaders in NIH, to whom I am eternally grateful, because they basically jumped in to take care of making all of the decisions and some potential commitments. So of course, in this case, for Alzheimer's, Richard Hodis was just absolutely essential to the belief that this could happen. For diabetes, Griff Rogers, all of those folks are going to speak here, I think. For rheumatoid arthritis, Steve Katz, who we still miss every day, and now Lindsay Criswell, but especially Bob Carter, who was just such a critical part of that. Those folks really gave this, from the NIH perspective, the kind of credibility it needed. And I was just looking to see, back in the day when we were just trying to set this up through that 2-year period, which was called the Target Validation Consortium, before it became AMP, the people in industry who were really putting their time and effort into this, Bill Haidt from J&J, Jim Sullivan, AbbVie, Patrick Vallance, GSK, isn't he now the chief scientist for the UK? Rupert Vesey at Merck, Doug Williams, Biogen, Tachi Yamada at Takeda, Elias Zerhouni, my predecessor as NIH director, who was at Sanofi, Bill Chin at Pharma, Francis Kuss at BMS, Michael Dulston at Pfizer, and Jan Lundberg at Lilly. All of those very senior leaders putting a lot of their time and effort into this. I think that's another lesson about why this worked, because it was a commitment at the top to make this a priority and not to just sort of delegate it and then hope it worked.
Yeah, that's great. And David, I think by now the AMP program model is really well appreciated by industry partners. We heard in Julie's remarks, 34 industry partners across the 10 programs. But how did you get industry to come to the table before the model had been tested and proven?
So a lot of that had to do with running a very transparent, very objective, very inclusive planning process. And this was one of the, I think, things that AMP did better than just about anybody else. In addition to this extended steering committee, confusingly called, which sort of ran the effort, we had each one of the 4 disease areas had a carefully assembled group that included key industry folks from the interested companies, NIH folks, academic experts, and we put them all in a room twice. The first time was to figure out sort of go over the landscape and figure out what could we do. And then the second time, and those reports were due back to the steering committee in April, and then by June, they had to have another meeting where they chose what it is that they really wanted to do, and then put that out in the form of a white paper. And then by October, the decision by the companies, which I recall we had a meeting in a darkened room because there was something called a government shutdown going on, took place, and that's where we moved forward. So industry had a lot of input on the way, and a very interesting thing is that people feel like, well, you just sort of picked a problem and that became the research strategy for that particular AMP. It didn't work that way. So I can remember coming out of the April meeting, the first meeting for Alzheimer's disease, we chose investigating the mechanism of action of APOE, developing cellular models of Alzheimer's using induced pluripotent stem cells, looking at neurodegeneration in animal models and in vitro models, and validating biomarkers, known biomarkers. That was the list that we presented upward. And as you're about to hear in the very exciting next presentation on the AMP and Alzheimer's disease, very little of that was there in June. And so we took a very open-ended approach. I think that helped get industry. And the other thing is that at their insistence, and I think it was a salutary thing, I don't think they trusted us entirely, right? They said, we want to have a milestone-based project plans, and we want to have the ability, if this thing isn't working out, halfway through, we get to take our money and go home. And so that was a different way of doing business with, I think, with government. But that went in there, and I think that really did help keep things moving on time and in place. So I think all those things, help really not just bring industry in, but made the entire thing more effective.
Those are great points, David. I got to add one more, which you wouldn't say, but I will, that FNIH, and particularly you, David Wally, with your credibility as a program manager who was going to be totally open, totally fair in making all the decisions, and was not going to sort of side with the academics or side with industry. You were going to be right in the middle of how to make this work. And people learned they could trust everything that was being led by you through FNIH. And I don't know if we could have done this without that honest broker that you and the foundation represented. A lot of people I don't think have quite picked out that part. I'm not sure when the Congress started FNIH way back in the 1990s that maybe that was really a concept they had in their mind, that this could be an enterprise that could serve as project manager for partnerships that otherwise would have a hard time really being able to go forward because it would always be a little skew in one direction or the other. And you made that work in a way that gradually people really got comfortable with. And it helped, of course, that FNIH had already done that for things like ADNI and the Biomarkers Consortium. There was some familiarity with that. But AMP took it to a whole nother level, and a level that since then has contributed to a lot of other things too, including PACT, the Partnership for Advancing Cancer Therapeutics, which had a lot of similarities with AMP. It just didn't get incorporated under the same umbrella. So yeah, again, as we all gather here these 10 years, I think there ought to be, as part of the celebration, a celebration of FNIH and what they were able to contribute, and particularly you, David.
Well, back at you, Francis. This wouldn't have gotten started without Francis Collins. And you talk about trust, the trust that you engendered, that we're going to get this done. I'm going to make sure that NIH is totally behind this. And the trust that they had in you and that you would deliver, I think, made all the difference in the world. This was, I think to me, people say, why was AMP a success? And whether it's, your leadership or Michael Dolston or the many folks that really were in the steering committees, which is where all the work got done, who were leaders from industry and the institutes and from academia. You know, the real thing for me was leadership from the top and commitment from the top and belief in this.
And it was fun to watch the scientists in these steering committees get to know each other, because I think before AMP, a lot of the people who ended up participating maybe had a small attitude about people them in their sector versus the other. Like academics, like, oh, those people in industry, you know, all I want to do is make money, and they're just crank turners, and they're not very creative. And the people in industry, oh, those people in academia, they just play in the lab and think they've done something when they publish a paper, and it doesn't matter. But then you put all these folks in the same room around the same goal, and things really start to happen, and the respect for each one goes up very significantly with each conversation, realizing these are really smart, visionary scientists with a different perspective. But isn't it always the case that the real advances happen when you bring together people with different disciplinary attitudes? That's what started to happen. And now I think a lot of these scientists are really good friends, and they never would have been without AMP.
Well, I think the coolest moment for me in my memories of all of AMP was I was in a meeting of one of it was the type 2 diabetes steering committee, and one of the scientists got up and announced that he was leaving Oxford for Genentech, and he said, I'm doing this because I learned so much about industry science and about the value of this in AMP. He says, if it hadn't been for AMP, I never would have made this career change. That was really cool.
So we have the broad theme areas. We have a couple of specific disease-focused projects with some open-ended research plans that allowed for some flexibility as the work progressed. We have bringing together the best part of government, the best part of industry, the best part of academia.
And the patient advocates.
And the patient advocates,
Let's be sure to
yes,
put that in there,
absolutely.
keeping us all focused on what really matters.
So it sounds like everything should have been a bed of roses, but I'm sure there was a bump or two along the way. So can you tell me, what did you think the biggest obstacle would be to overcome in launching this project, and then what actually turned out to be the biggest obstacle?
Okay, so for me, I thought we'd get the money together a lot faster than we did. We announced this thing in February, and FNIH finally got its last initial payment from one of the industry partners in October. Now, we had a number of things we were able to do to get things off the ground and get moving because we had NIH money in place in most, but not all cases. But that was we went through all this process, but it's still the machinery of having to, get the internal approvals to do this was there. And so we've kept that in mind as we develop other partnerships. And then the other thing I think we found was, companies don't stay in the same therapeutic area for 10 years, never mind 3 years. And how are we going to deal with the fact that things change? And I think the great wisdom was putting together this multi-stakeholder executive committee and empowering them to make the decisions. And I do remember that a number of the industry R&D leads, Michael Dolston and others, said, if we're going to do this, we're in this together and we're in this for the long term. So you can't just kind of come in and come out because that vitiates the value of all the other industry partners' investment. So it helped, but we did have a few situations we had to manage along the way.
Yeah, those were indeed challenges, and maybe I was not as prepared as I should have been for those kinds of changes. And they were sometimes scientific changes, and sometimes they were just turnover of leadership, and the new leader just didn't have the same view that the previous one did. I got to say, we were benefited and continue to be by the consistent, very strong leadership from Michael Dolston, who was there at the origin and continues now to serve as co-chair of the executive committee. And he's one of the few, I think, in pharma that has had that kind of durability, and it has really made a difference to be able to sustain a lot of what AMP is doing. But there are other real heroes in that space as well. I think thinking about Paul Stoffels, for instance, who is also very much in that space, and Bill Haidt. And now we have Helman Ashrafian from Sanofi, who's also as part of the executive committee. So they stuck with it. And that was my anxiety, that this wouldn't be sustainable, that people would tire of it. Because we were asking a lot with meetings to go over data, and these are substantive meetings that were not just fluff or rubber stamping. They were like, got to make a decision here. You know, do we do this or do we do that? And do we have the money to do so? So I guess my greatest fear was it would sound good, it would get off to a good start, but after a year or two, people would be kind of looking for something else. But it never happened. And again, that's a credit to those steering committees for each of the diseases who kept the energy going and kept producing really interesting results. And of course, there was this question about, is this actually going to make a difference? Because this was, after all, an intention to take a landscape of exciting information about disease and translate that into something that would be actionable, to find targets that would be worth government investing in. We did one survey, I think, David, you ran this back in 2019, after 5 years, and I really held my breath, because the question was, what has the impact been of AMP on target prioritization activities for Alzheimer's, rheumatoid arthritis, and diabetes? And there were questions about new targets of interest, and questions of targets that were known but now at higher priority, and questions about targets that are now deprioritized, because there's something about Mendelian randomization that sometimes really gives you insight you didn't have before. And in every situation, there was a substantial indication that this was having an impact, both in academia, in government, and especially in industry. And interestingly, in industry, it was particularly this deprioritization of targets that had looked good, but when you get the genetics part in there, we're not really looking at something that's probably the right target. It's something related and downstream. That was striking to see. It'd be fun to do that again, now that another 5 years have gone by, and see what the results would be. But as a concrete evidence that this project was working, that gave me a great deal of excitement.
So we do have some time for questions from the audience, if you'd like to come up to the podium mics. And while people are coming to the mics, let me ask one more question. When you launched the program in 2014, what was your metric of success? And did anything along the way surprise you in terms of the successes and impacts?
Yeah, again, I think a lot of it was the hope that this really would change the way in which targets were perceived. You know, we had to set up AMP so that it was really pre-competitive, and when something got to a point about making a decision of a company to go after a target, then that had to sort of step away. But we could be very public about what the wall of targets looked like. We actually called it the wall of targets for various of these conditions, and try to then prioritize them, and I think that had an influence on what people were likely to do next. So that was a big part of the goal, but it was also, in many other ways, a chance to explore areas we hadn't thought about. I was so impressed with the differences between these three projects in terms of what they did look at. Alzheimer's, trying to figure out, do PET scans for tau actually add a lot compared to what we could do with amyloid? With rheumatoid arthritis, which got very much into single cell biology back in the day where that really wasn't being done that much, and taught us a lot about how you can use that information by looking at the synovial biopsy of somebody with RA and figure out what cells are really involved here in causing the inflammatory response. And then for diabetes, really trying to take apart a very complicated set of genetic factors and figure out what are the nodes that you could begin to see appearing from that data. All of that, I guess, was a outcome that I'm not sure I knew was going to happen, but it was benefited by the fact that these projects were all so specifically designed to fill gaps that were otherwise not happening. And that was another metric, I guess, although I don't know if we designed it that way. Really new knowledge, new technology, new insights into the diseases, some of them directly leading to a target, but some of them just understanding the fundamentals.
Yeah, how about you, David? You were in the day-to-day of the early project management. What was success looking like for you?
Well, I think the vigor and determination with which the steering committees and our FNIH project managers, prosecuted these research agendas was what was most inspiring to me. I mean, these were each of these steering committees was meeting every 2 weeks. And for people to give that kind of commitment of time out of their day jobs, and the sort of burden of having to staff that and consistently move forward and solve all the political problems was tremendous. And I guess the other surprise for me was when we started this, I was like, okay, we're going to get these 3 disease areas, and we're going to see if we can be successful. And if we're really successful, we might get a follow-on in 1 or 2 of these areas. And have follow-ons not just in 1 or 2 of these areas, but something like 4 or 5 more AMPs in different disease areas, and gone from like it was $125 million investment to over $800 million. I succeeded beyond my wildest dreams, so that was a surprise.
No one at the mic, so I'll take my moderator privilege. Is there anything that you would go back and change if you could do it all over again?
I would involve the patient organizations more fully in the design from the very base, up. I believe in the mantra, nothing about us without us. And I think partly because of all the risk and the complexity, that first year of planning was done without probably very many. I think once the agenda was there, the patient organizations were brought in certainly before the announcement and given every opportunity to participate. But we've learned since then, and we do this planning now. We involve these patient organizations, not just in the governance, which is is an easy one, but in the actual planning as to what they think directions we ought to take to best help patients.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that would have been a really important major addition at the beginning, and it took us a little while to get there, and we can never do too much. So for the patient advocates that are here in the room, thank you for your coming alongside, and we want that input more than ever as we go forward. And with additional AMPs that get talked about that might be thinking about getting off the ground, let's be sure. I'm not involved at this point in making that happen, but Courtney will, to be sure that we get that input in the most credible way we possibly can.
Absolutely. The FNIH now has a commitment to 100% of projects, patient engagement along the entire continuum of development and execution. And I think AMP really set the model for that in some of the earlier days. Yes, from the audience.
Hi, I'm Alessio Travaglia. I'm the director of the neuroscience team at the FNIH. This is a great presentation, and can you hear me?
Yeah, closer to the mic. Yeah.
Hi again. I'm Alessio Travaglia. I'm the director of the neuroscience team at the FNIH. This was a fantastic presentation, a great way to start this meeting. I wonder when in 15 years from now we're going to have the 25-year anniversary. What do you think we are going to celebrate? Is it going to be about data integration? Is it going to be artificial intelligence, or what else?
Oh my, things move so quickly that it's hard to predict next year, and you're asking us to jump way into the future. With all these exponential curves that we're trying to ride, it's pretty tough to know exactly where they might land. I do think we're at this point where a lot of what AMP is able to do is exploding with its opportunity, and things like AI are certainly going to be a significant part of that. But again, as maybe Larry Tabak said in his opening remarks, I would hope we would also see by that point some very clear examples of where clinical benefits have arrived for patients who were waiting for them because of the work that AMP did that pointed to a direction that led to a therapeutic that otherwise might not have happened. That would be the real metric to say this has been a big success.
Yeah, I totally agree. At the end of the day, did you produce or accelerate the development of more effective therapies for patients? That's where the rubber meets the road.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yes.
Rima Dauk from the Duke Medical Center. Fascinating history. In looking back at the 10 years of engagement within the Foundation NIH, have we missed an opportunity to bring the clinical trials with all big data we generated to understand disease heterogeneity, complexity? Should we partner more effectively, on the one hand, with the ongoing clinical trials, try to inform them, and on the other hand, partner even more with the pharmaceutical companies in this process of prioritization, testing our targets, screening of libraries, and bringing the power of artificial intelligence. Can we do more moving forward? But yeah.
Well, we certainly have been engaging with clinical trials in some instances, like Alzheimer's, for instance, trying to agree to kind of standards about how we evaluate the status of any given patient with scans. It does get tricky when it comes to things like screening libraries, because now you're getting into competitive space. And I think one of the reasons this has worked so well is that companies felt that they could still be in a position to compete effectively with other companies, but they could be full bore involved in AMP for the pre-competitive part of it. So I think we've been pretty careful not to step across that line. But as much as one can move things that might traditionally be seen as like behind the curtain, outside and into the pre-competitive space, I think AMP has tried to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree, and I think there's some merit in having a focus in a partnership, right? You get to the clinical space, you're starting to involve very different people than the discovery and translational science people in companies. And so, yeah, absolutely. I'm hoping some of these efforts, things like the AMP and schizophrenia are going to end up feeding into more interventional trials. But the foundation does a number of different partnerships that do exactly what it is you're saying. From the Biomarkers Consortium that founded the I-SPY 2 trial in cancer, and now there's a whole collaborative effort with the National Cancer Institute called LungMap and lung cancer, and the effort we did in active to rapidly. We ran 11, 12 master protocols with a lot of input from industry. So it just might not happen within AMP, but AMP's identity and focus from the beginning was very much more in that sort of preclinical, but translational science space, and on target identification and validation. So it doesn't mean that there's been a lot of flexibility and a lot of change, but it doesn't mean that you have to do all the clinical stuff in AMP or that you have to do all the target validation in another partnership. I think there are multiple engines to be able to address it.
David, I'm glad you brought up active and what happened in COVID-19 in terms of a partnership that was desperately needed and became possible, I think, very frankly, because of the experience that had been already successfully conducted with AMP. Think back to March of 2020, as it was clear that SARS-CoV-2 was spreading rapidly across the world, including in the US. We had our strong sense that this was going to be the greatest, most significant challenge to biomedical research in 100 years, maybe ever, to try to come up with a strategy. This was the moment where we had to be sure we were bringing all of the parties together who had a chance of finding therapeutics and building vaccines. And how do we do that? So in late March, I started making calls to those folks in industry that I already knew really well because of AMP, saying, I know you guys are working on this. You know we are too. Can we do this together? And I called FDA in the same question. Now, normally to put together a partnership that was going to focus on how to design master protocols for vaccines and therapeutics, how to prioritize what should be done as far as testing various pharmaceuticals that might be repurposed for COVID-19, you can imagine, based on our initial experience with AMP, that would be a 2-year project. In 2 weeks, the first convening of what became active, accelerating COVID-19 therapeutics, interventions, and vaccines came together. And there was no hesitation. Everybody just basically said, okay, I know you. I guess we're going to trust each other to do this. We're not going to worry too much about who gets the credit. This is a worldwide crisis. We have the skills and the resources. Let's put them to work. That was phenomenal. And active, which took on a huge number of challenges. And again, would never have worked without FNIH, without David and his team, and it was quite a team of project managers, went through this process of prioritizing more than 800 compounds that were being proposed as possible repurposing, ultimately 29 of those going into clinical trials in a rigorous randomized way. Had to deal with how to put together those clinical trial networks to make that happen, had to design all those master protocols, both for therapeutics and for vaccines, and make sure they were adhered to. And all that got done. And people were working 100-hour weeks and meeting pretty much around the clock, as far as I could tell. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we'd have pulled that off if we'd not had the background, that confidence, that sense of trust in each other that AMP had created. So when we started AMP, I never thought that this would be an important contributor to addressing the worst pandemic in a century, because I didn't know that was coming. But it's kind of the way it turned out. I wanted everybody in this room to know that. That was a significant foundation for something really remarkable that came to pass.
Good.
Yes.
Hello, thanks for an amazing presentation. I'm always, today even more than usual, blown away by the advocacy of the FNIH and what you've been able to accomplish. I'm Brandon Stagel, and I'm president of One Mind. We are a partner in the AMP Schizophrenia. And I want to suggest a potentially radical idea to build on the AMPs and the success of the AMPs. What about an accelerating services partnership program? Because, for example, in psychiatric illnesses, for example, we know that there are a number of services that are useful, but they're not put together in very effective ways to help the recovery of people who are struggling with mental illnesses. Things like coordinated specialty care, things like clubhouses, things like peer supports in the community. And my bet is that there'll be a number of healthcare companies and even newer companies like involved in digital health that might be interested in participating in such a services partnership financially and with advice and guidance, as well as many patient organizations that would love to participate in something like that. Has that been anything that's crossed the FNIH's mind before, or anything you could consider for the future?
It's certainly a need, isn't it? Oh my goodness. I've not heard that raised as a possibility, but again, I might not have. David or Courtney, do you all have any sense that that kind of a conversation is out there somewhere?
Not to my knowledge yet, but within the last year, we have assembled the FNIH patient ambassadors, many of whom are affiliated with the AMPs, and we'll be hearing some more from them tomorrow. I think that maybe that's something that they could bring forward and help us think about what that type of partnership would look like and how to implement it. So thank you. I jotted that down.
Thanks, Brandon.
Thank you.
Speaking of ambassadors.
I think it's a great idea. I mean, we actually are trying to do some things in the neuropsych area and areas like depression and so forth, but they are more on the science side. But I think everybody knows the biggest challenge we have right now in these neuropsychiatric disorders is, and the biggest emergency is in doing something about the healthcare delivery system. And this type of implementation science partnership you're talking about is, I think, urgently needed. I'm not sure it's an FNIH thing. It's a totally different set of partners, right? Both on the government side and, as you mentioned, the company side. But yeah, I think we need a national effort in that direction. That's all I'll say.
One more question from the audience.
Sure, a quick one. Sharon Terry from Genetic Alliance. I've served on the executive steering committee since the start. Thank you both for all of you for all that you've given. I'm always awed because I work a lot with industry and advocacy and academia, and the progress we've made is astounding to me, and the methods are incredible. And so I've often wondered how it would be that we could get this out there more and look at something like, I don't know, a Harvard Business Review, or I'm talking more about the actual process that I think could be used in other places because of the mechanisms that have been developed.
Great idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a good idea. I don't think that's been done. There hasn't been sort of a systematic kind of review of that sort, unless it has.
Not for AMP.
Yeah.
We've had a few conversations more broadly about the FNIH and the public-private partnerships, but certainly a focused effort would be fantastic. All right, Francis, last words.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation with my friends, David and Courtney, and all of you. And again, a great opportunity to reflect on where we've come and where we may be going. And I'm thrilled that, in fact, we are here not just to talk about celebrating the past, but particularly talk about where we can go next with this now set of 8 or 10 projects, and maybe others that are being thought about that are potentially in the offing. Final thing I just want to say is it was a great privilege to be the NIH director and to have a chance to sort of see this opportunity, but it never would have happened if it had not also caught the imagination and the energy of the institute directors that came alongside and put their time and effort into this in a very substantive way. And I mentioned already the early help that got it off the ground from Richard Hodis, from Steve Katz, and from Griff Rogers. But since then, with other projects that have come along, Walter Koroshetz being the champion to get the Parkinson's effort going, Josh Gordon to get schizophrenia going, Chris Austin, and now Joni Rutter with the Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium, and Gary Gibbons with HFpEF heart failure. That is just so gratifying to see the way in which all of these folks who have a lot on their plate and a lot of budgetary challenges have understood that this is something they wanted to be part of and have become just incredible leaders. So I just want to say thank you to those folks. You have made AMP what it really has turned out to be.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank both of you for your leadership and your vision and for coming back to tell this story and for joining us